computer probably. So, welcome to our 2020 Summit, Open Security Summit. And this is the session how to measure and visualize ISG standards. We have our organizers with us, and we are excited to host you here, and I hope you as well. So before starting, I will share our welcome slides. Yes, welcome to our summit. What we expect from all of you: participation, mutual respect, that we care about each other deeply. We have challenge each other and learn from each other. We very much appreciate openness in our summit, so everything will be recorded, sometimes even live streamed. As I mentioned, if you don't want to be identified, you can take some precautions. Otherwise, everything here will be recorded. So we are here to respect each other, collaborate, learn from each other. We respect each other professionalism, and we want to, after our trainings, to get some real-time practices that can be used in your companies, in our company, and that it will be really productive and useful for everyone. Please tweet us in our OSS 22, or please share also Slack in Slack and invite your friends, colleagues, anyone who is interested in our topics. After, I will share also Slack link that you can invite your friends. So with this, I'm passing the ball to our organizers so that can they can continue from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tatevik. I think this is one of those things that's kind of a bit more of a discussion rather than a kind of like a real sort of presentation for us, because I think that we've got two, I mean, if you look at the thing of that, we've got two potentially different sort of things kind of listed here. One is for the NSA's, inspection, sanitation gaze. It's like how can we generate some sort of effective measure of what they actually are, and the other one is then how to, which is I think is the really tricky one, is how can we visualize either that or the in terms of the document. And I mean, and I'd be curious to kind of get some other sort of views on that. And I think what I'm going to quickly do is kind of go through my kind of view, at least on the measurement side of it, because I've been kind of looking over the last few days at these documents. It is the first time I've really had a good look at them and kind of thinking like, how could we have an objective measure of what those documents actually contain and what and how we can actually measure against them. So I'm just going to do is just want to share my screen if I can find the right
sorry to just quickly chip in, Greg, but yeah, for the benefit of those on the meeting at the moment, I'm not sure how many were present in the introduction that we had yesterday. Are you okay us proceeding on premise that you're aware what we're talking about from the introduction we had yesterday?
Good point, Vinh. Thank you.
If I can quickly run through basically the gist of the introduction we had yesterday, which is the videos already for public consumption, is we're at the moment looking at the NSA documents and using that as a guidance for looking at the for example, this PNG, all the areas where we can follow the recommendations that are outlined, and we were basically looking at trying to create a means of capturing this as JSON files for consumption. And I think at this point, this is where we are today, and trying to how we can measure and visualize this. So back to you, Greg.
Thank you, Vin. And I think we should also apologise in advance to any of those. We've got quite a few folks from Glasswall on this call, and we might go into some technical stuff about how some of our products work. So apologies for that if we get that. But if you want to know more or you don't understand, please stop us and ask. We're more than willing to kind of take on those questions and try and explain. But it's just be aware that, you know, we quite often we can kind of go off on our own little tangent that's very specific to some of our products, which other people might not be interested, or you may be interested in but don't understand. So please give us a shout if that's the case. So the first kind of thing was the measure part of it, and I actually think that this is actually something that's actually reasonably straightforward for us to potentially do, or to kind of create some metrics out of it. So, and my focus was within the ISG documents, we've got, for all the different types of risks, we've got these sections here, and the way that I kind of visualize this myself is it lists a number of validations and then some actions. So I don't know, I haven't done the counting myself, but we may potentially, you know, for any of these particular documents, we can say it lists 20 validations and 15 actions. And then for any products we got or any filters, it gives us something quite easy to match against, because we can say, yeah, there's 20 validations in this document, we're doing all of them, we're doing 15 of them. And from that, there's a further, from those validations, there's another, you know, 15 actions, and we're doing X, Y, Z of them. So to me, that gives us some potential for some quite simple but powerful metrics of how some of our products or how some of our inspections or some of our validations in some of these files can kind of be mapped. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if you saw the thumb. Yeah, it definitely it makes sense.
I mean, it's a very simple way, and then later on you could delve into create some more detail. But if you kind of wanted to create that headline, how compliant are you against this guide? It seemed to me is the simplest way of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I had a quick glance through the Office binary, sort of the Microsoft Word 2000 up to 2003, I think it's listed as. Reading some of the details there, and they're quite wordy, they're quite descriptive, so they're not very easy to sort of classify into sort of simple sets of tests. I think they'd all end up being quite detailed to construct, but but clearly we could identify them and list them and get our sort of, we're looking at using our regression test tools to do this, but they are basically itemizing those tests into things that we can then automate the validation of and produce reports from, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's where then, I think.
Sorry, go on, Greg.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Well, as I say, even then, this is possibly something that we could do at a BDD level, as these are essentially validation rules stacked on top of what we can find through BDDs, right?
You mean DVLs? But yes.
Oh yeah, I was trying not to use DVL for the people who didn't know what they were.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, you instantly fall into that. Yes. Quick note. Yeah, internally we have a set of files that describe the structures, which we call them BDDs, and we have DVLs, which are validation rules, which say what any particular value within any structure should be, whether it's a range of values or whether there's some piece of code that needs to be fired against it to say, does it correlate correctly with something else? So yes, it certainly occurred to me, of the sort of thousands of validation rules we have, there are probably correlations between a lot of these, and maybe it could end up not even necessarily. Some of these I think we could almost do on a visual check and say, no, we remove that by doing so and so, or that test is dealt with by this particular process, which is slightly different. Because I think some of the things I saw in there were validations that said, oh, we do this or remove this or change that, or this value shouldn't be there. And our approach may be, no, we dislike that whole lump and that gets removed. Therefore, that particular test in its exact form becomes difficult to invalidate because we've actually negated its effect in a way.
So potentially that's another, so there's potentially, for the metric side of it, there's actually, rather than say for either the validations or or the action, what I term as actions, rather than saying actually we're complying to it. It's actually we've got an alternative to it.
In quite a lot of cases, yes.
Yeah.
Is there a link?
Or it might have been removed as a side effect of something we did.
Yes, there is that.
That's the thing to bear in mind.
Yes, as we read stuff in. Sorry, someone was asking a question. No.
Yeah, is there a link that we might be able to have to be able to review and go through some of these standards at some point? The ISG,
sorry.
The well, like what he was mentioning about the.
I want to build like a correlation to sort of literally go through these and review them. Yeah, I think that is something I've sort of thought of maybe an exercise.
I didn't mean correlation.
Yes,
no,
I know.
I meant like a link, that we could be able to go to and read them.
The ISGs.
Correct.
Yes, they're all publicly accessible.
Yeah.
Someone will dig them out.
Right,
See if I can post them. Are you going to post them, Greg?
I can.
Yeah. So it's actually I'll drop the link here. It's actually we've actually put them.
I think if you scroll down, Greg, I think there's a link to the place.
There you go.
So HTML there.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Does this have a notion of notes where you can paste sort of information like that for other attendees to just pick up?
We've been putting it in the chat, and then afterwards the chat gets taken and put, at least the relevant portions of the chat get taken and put actually up on the website underneath the presentation.
Okay.
I was just looking for the chat, so I can put this.
I'm looking for the chat as well, actually.
Which I had open a minute ago.
I don't know where that is. How do you get to chat? Oh, I can see it there. The button. Oh, type message here. So I'd be the first. Okay.
If you could post those links, Martin, that would be really useful. So we got that covered.
Yes, I'm just going to.
Great, all these lovely products that neatly hide menus for you while you're not using them, which is great.
Just make sure you're sending it to everybody in there.
I think I've blasted it onto there. Can everyone see?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got that.
Bingo.
That's it.
Crikey, I think we all know what we're doing.
Yeah.
That's pushing it, Steve.
So which specific one are we referring to here, Greg?
Sorry?
Which specific ISG are we going to be using for an example here?
We're going to look at the PNG one because it tries to get it up because I think it's one that Dennis was using in the session yesterday evening, and it's actually quite a straightforward one because it's some of the other ones. I mean, I've got the other one I got is open as PDF, and it kind of on some of the other things it kind of highlights some of the issues around the visualization, and I think Steve kind of intimated to that because there are sometimes you've actually got multiple. Sometimes it covers multiple versions of the document, or there's things that are slightly different elements of it. That makes it, for when you're coming around, I think to try and visualize some of this stuff of how you could actually take content of these ISGs and kind of put it into some sort of like usable form makes it a little bit more difficult. And that, I mean, that was that was kind of where I started to become unstuck a little bit on the visualization. I mean, when yesterday on the session, he says, I'm just trying to find the right tab. What Dennis did, he started to try and say, actually, could we capture some of this stuff in a JSON file? And I think it's one of those things we'd probably need to kind of think quite hard about what the structure of that is, because if you go back to the actual like validations and actions, there's not necessarily a straightforward one-to-one correlation between and some of the validations and what some of the actions might be. Some of them, it's more of a many-to-many. Some of them tend to be, because of the way they're worded, a kind of a some indirect dependencies. I think it's the only way I can kind of explain it. You know, it's not necessarily, if you do this validation, you can come forward and get one of these results out. It may be actually you do a load of validations and you somehow got to string them together to kind of work out that this has actually happened. And it's something, when you think about it as a human looking at something, it seems quite straightforward to do it, but it'd be one of those things that may be quite difficult for get a computer to do, or you might end up having, like we want to do, is we want to use it as a basis for testing. You might end up with having to say, actually, to kind of fully verify this, I'm going to end up with quite a large number of tests. But that was just kind of my initial thoughts of trying to think about how to kind of visualize this stuff.
Yes, I mean, looking at number 5 on that list, it's just a nice blanket coverage, isn't it? I guess this was sort of the point I was raising the other day, that a lot of these are really, you know, good descriptions of things to look for and issues to deal with. Sometimes they kind of be sort of, they seem to be worded sometimes more towards picking out a particular problem. But this one's a little bit, you know, nice and useful, where you're talking about number 5, reject data with unrecognized chunks. That's by our nature is the, you know, we always sort of do the reverse of that, and we say we'll only accept the stuff that we know is named, identified in the specifications as absolutely meant to be there, and anything that doesn't fit that criteria in the schema will either break the file when we try, or will break our mechanism, because it'll go, oh, no, we can't construct that, it doesn't have the things it's meant to be there, or it'll isolate out those ones that are meant to be there and drop ones out that aren't, and still have a usable file. So by its very nature, it will, you know, effectively do that, and that will be the case for most of our file processing, what we call cameras. Any sort of specifics to say, oh, we must remove this, or we must remove that, we'd almost go, well, we cross the board. We will leave that behind. As you say, it's a side effect.
It's a side effect of our strategy, which is just to keep the known good.
Yeah. So in that case, you could certainly put together some files with some dummy data in places that aren't meant to be there, and see whether they get rejected, as they should be. But it would be, you know, a small sample of that as a proof.
It's kind of interesting, because what you actually get is actually that what we're actually doing is kind of the reversing of what was actually suggested there. Is actually what we're not rejecting stuff that's unrecognized, is that we're only accepting recognized. Then everything else gets discarded.
Yes.
Which, from a proof perspective, is actually then is a little bit more difficult, because, you know, if you're trying to validate against what somebody else has actually stated in this particular case, it's like we can't, you know, is how would you could show a reasonable number of samples, and then to actually show that we actually accept, yes, this is the only stuff that, you know, we accept these, we don't accept these. It's quite difficult, because it could be anything.
So may I ask real quick? This is what you're working on having run in kind of in the background of Glasswall to remove and reject these different kinds of files? Is this how?
Well, this is what we do. The question has been raised here really is that we have lots of sort of test files, test suites, and test criteria, and we do sort of put files through that we know have particular faults in, then check that those come out the other end removed or rejected or whatever. These ISGs have identified a whole series of quite well-known, important, specific types of cleaning and checking and validation. And so we sort of like to try and validate against these and make sure that all of our current validation, all of our current processing meets all of these criteria, so that we can at least sort of say, well, we think we do far more than this anyway, and by inference we reckon we'll probably cover all of these, but it would be silly not to do a review or a check just to make sure that, you know, there isn't something in some of these ISGs that we've gone, oh, you know, hello, we somehow missed that, or there was a little caveat that we didn't quite think about.
Right, so specifically, this is just what you're using kind of as a check, and I guess we'll probably be going through and looking at and seeing what you have set up more there as well, or?
Yeah, well, these are been published as a sort of a standard to say, this is the the minimum quality that the NSA would expect from these things to do, and obviously we want to make sure that we do actually match that at the very least. As I say, we already do a vast number of tests and checks, and it would be just silly not to do a little confirmation, or if a little, it's going to be quite a large amount of work. But these would at least add to our formal tests, and we could then we'd have that as a way of correlating that against these.
Yeah, we can
these
actually
tests.
quantify what our test.
Yes. Well, we can add
to.
Yes, and we can extend some of these. There's some particular things that we're testing. We go, I think there was something on I won't get into details, but there was something on Microsoft on Doc that I saw talking about the internal structure, and I thought, oh yeah, they check that, but they didn't. It didn't sound like there was one particular check that I know we do. So there is this hope that we will be able to start feeding back to these documents ourselves to say, oh, there's these other things that we check for, which we think are quite important. And they should be in there as well. So it's really just sort of a yardstick to compare against. I'm not sure how long these documents have been published for, but we were sort of building these things about 10 years ago. So these may well be later than that.
I saw 2011 on some of these documents. So
okay, so they've been around a while then.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it is the whole sort of like content disarm regeneration kind of sphere within cybersecurity has kind of not really been that mature or that long, or some of the players that are kind of not particularly well known. But I think for all of us, this is kind of really the only really sort of like public standard of how to measure your product. And that's kind of, I think, is why
it sets the benchmark.
Yeah, this is the benchmark of how good is your product at doing what it's supposed to do. And I think
I guess that part's pretty clear. I was just wondering if this is kind of what, I guess, where you were taking it was using it with Glasswall, just checking against it. That was basically the question I had.
I think the idea behind this is to create almost this sort of general purpose sort of framework that allows you to measure against every item within these documents. So it's sort of understanding how we can extract this information into sort of a form that we can programmatically start sort of inspecting or validating against it. So it's a discussion around how we can actually sort of accomplish that.
Okay, so in a sense, using the same principles that you would with reverse engineering, just taking it and actually automating it for using with different.
Precisely, yes.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. Just trying to think of all the steps that go through from taking something that's like a textual document to kind of some form of database that's got what we're validating against. And the ultimately sort of thing, is from that to actually generate the tests. The interesting thing is also with some of these is like, can you also be smart and actually generate the data, or do you have to go through some form of manual creation of the data? Because that's, to be quite honest, that's probably the big time consumer.
Yeah, I think that definitely would be.
I have a question. I'm sorry, Steve. Go on.
Yeah.
I just have a question a little bit about the provenance of these ISGs. I've sent you a private message, Steve, just to correct myself. I can tell everyone that the date published for the ping we're looking at the moment is 31st of January 2018. But what I would like to know is, the definitive resource for any of this is actually the specification itself. Does the ISG refer to the version of the specification that it pertains to?
Yeah, we raised this as a point of contention yesterday, and the idea is those JSONs or the ISGs that we're creating in our own repo, the ISG repo that it's on the chat, they will where we're trying to extract those recommendations, we are also linking it to the specs, for example, the PNG specs. So ultimately, the goal is
you've still got to comply to that.
We can come to one place and branch off to find all the correct specifications and cross-reference them all.
So that's so in there, that's a little rubric there, just saying what versions of pin were versions. But does this document actually say that it pertains to the extensions 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2, or is it implying that there were later versions which introduced new chunks? Is that actually saying that that is using the latest version of the ping spec?
Good question, Martin. And to be quite honest, I haven't read it, this particular one, in the depth to know.
No, I wasn't trying to get an answer. No. Just as a sort of point that we, as I said a few years ago, I went through and had to get all the latest versions of all the different specs for the file types that we use, Office, binary, etc. And there were quite a few upgrades. Some were just cosmetic changes, and they documented that, and some were actually new structures, etc., had been added to the actual file format. And of course, we really have to know that we are conforming to the latest spec, because as you know, sometimes we get documents come through and we have no knowledge of the structure that's in it. So and maybe then we find out it's been added to the spec, which we haven't been aware of.
So maybe that's the benefit of us having this ISG then, because we are staying ahead of these NSA documents, because listening yesterday, they don't seem to be updated that often, and we do find these new updates ourselves. We can put it in our ISG, what spec we're working against or can work against, and the idea is to contribute to this NSA document.
But is the ISG merely a tool for us to be able to confirm our testing? It can't. We have to use the official specs to code what we are going to.
Oh, we are. What I'm saying is the ISG is a place to go to start branching off to the correct specifications, and a means for everyone to come to a common place to get further information, and also cross-reference all the specs.
I think that the way I kind of view it to a certain extent, Martin, is that if you look at the published date of any of the particular ISGs, because they do vary over time, is that from our point of view, we could only potentially say this is relevant to any specifications published up to that release date for that ISG, because we do know there are changes to some of those specifications. When you look at some of the Microsoft specifications, they change quite regularly, probably a lot more often than some of the like the actual ISG. So we know that there's things that the ISGs aren't necessarily going to cover, but the specifications provide us enough clue what to actually do. And also, if you consider, if we've got an ISG that's a couple of years old, there could be new threats that have come through, new exploits found that are not covered by the ISGs.
Indeed.
So I was wondering if there's something that that the NSA actually puts out showing just the changes, because that would be actually useful. That could be something that I think would be most easily usable for making sure that it's up to date.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Actually, if they don't have anything like that, I might just see about mentioning it that way.
Yeah.
Well, they do have before you get the file, they do push. They do say date published, last reviewed, as well. But I don't know if that gives us that as a granularity.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they've got a little bit of stuff like that, and I've seen in some other NSA documents that they've kind of have. Sometimes they have quite large revision histories of what they've actually changed within the document. how easy it would be to kind of track that into the document itself to see what's really changed. You know, that might, that might be quite difficult to do.
I mean, it is pretty simple. I was just thinking for the number of people that would probably have to do it, that would be kind of wild.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of the interesting things, isn't it? For all those, how you actually deal with some of the changes to come through. Do you publish a completely brand new document, or do you actually say, okay, here's some updates to apply? I think most people kind of like to have the complete document, because if you end up with bits and pieces all over the place, you know, it's like you could easily miss one.
Oh yeah, but I mean, even with different programs, there have been, you know, ways of dealing with that. You don't, you know, the major things you don't miss. You get the full thing. Smaller things, you know, like versions versus like updates or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually it's interesting here. I'm seeing I'm looking at the 2003 ISG, and it says Microsoft recently published its file format specifications. The team highly, in their emphasis, recommends that file inspection and sanitization software developers use this data vigorously. Further, if conflicts exist between this document and Microsoft specifications, consider the latter authoritative. And then it gives the links for the actual document. So it's basically saying what we know anyway, that the specification is the definitive guide to how we pass and control these documents. And the ISG, of course, is based on that, and kind of itemizes a lot of the tests and parsing that helps testing, basically, doesn't it? So that's really where it's coming from.
I know I'm actually quite enjoying this conversation. We kind of potentially got a little bit off topic, because we were really kind of thinking about, okay, the measure of it, which I think follow kind of what I said, or what I kind of suggested is probably a reasonable way to do it. And I think there's, or what Steve said, it's actually we need to think about stuff where, if we're talking about how well we do measure ourselves against it, we need to think about stuff where we don't do what it actually says because we do something different that's as good as. And then the other part of it was how can we represent the contents of this document in a form that's consumable for some form of test analysis or some type of comparison. So
$64,000 question.
Open it up to kind of see what who's I mean, anybody kind of looked at this and thought about how we could potentially do this, or got any ideas?
Well, it does remind me of some things that we sort of worked a few ideas around in the past, which was the idea of using various third-party tools that could generate documents from programmatically, like the Adipose library, or I forget the other one that we've used on some of our test suites to build Office documents. Yeah, I think the only downside with those is possibly that they will only want to create nice clean documents and not documents or document artifacts that are faulty. So by nature, they probably won't actually help you create.
I've got a suggestion. Sorry, Stephen. You've actually led me to this with what you've mentioned, and obviously we've got the capability to expose the internals of a document, right?
Modify the imports.
Can we not utilize that to start manipulating certain areas of the document, so we produce documents that kind of we can use to test and verify each one of these items in the ISGs themselves?
Yes, I was going to sort of come around to that. I did think our own interchange formats could be used. You could take a template file, make some modifications to it that inject a particular type of damage, put it back through the camera to say, right, rebuild this, but don't, well, actually it doesn't matter. You could actually re-import, or you do it either way. You could either sort of say accept this as it is and produce it verbatim, and then run it through our cameras again just to say, right, here's this file from some other place, check from scratch that we rebuild it and the validation picks it up, or as it's re-imported, it would go through our validation anyway. So there's two ways of doing it. But yes, certainly that we expose all of that. So we have, well, we use it for tagging, so we can manipulate.
Just speaking practically, we could effectively try an exercise to actually produce these documents. And once we've created a set of documents that actually have complete coverage of, say, one of these ISGs, we could then take those test files and add them to that repository, which then means that anyone else can actually use it. So anyone in the community can actually utilize those documents to verify those specific bits.
Yeah.
Am I making any sense there?
Yes, yeah,
Yes,
I think there's a
sense.
lot of potential there. Yeah, I think I know from the guys doing the tagging stuff, we need to do some.
Sorry, I'm going to stop you, Steve, because I didn't quite fully understand what Elvin was getting at.
So I'll try and go through it in a simplified form. So imagine we've got a standard document. We take it into our engine, which then gives us that and we run it through our export, which gives us that internal representation of the file.
Yeah.
We've got access to every part of it. Using the ISGs, we can go to a specific area. Let's say, for instance, in this particular example, pointing to the header or the signature of the file, we can go in that exported package, manipulate that file to actually have that flaw in it, that problem, and we can then import it. So we now produce a document with that problem, right? Which means we can take that document, add it to that repository. So we've now got a test file to test against. Now the verification, for instance, could be, for example, if this recommends that you clean it out or you remove that chunk of data, you can then process that file, and your test would then be, do you still have that sequence of bytes present in the file or not? If they're not there, then your test succeeded. So that's sort of the thought process I had behind it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's kind of my sense. I was just trying to think, because that's still quite a lot of. You've effectively got to go through every single bit of the ISG, though, haven't you? Kind of make those tests.
So there's the potential that we could at least programmatically do some of this if we're able to extract some of this data from here into an intermediate format like JSON or XML. At that point, we can write tools that understand those intermediate formats and can make those manipulations across both sets. It's still quite a lot of work. It does still mean going through each one of these items to actually produce that, but that's currently all I can think of, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I mean, the thing of actually doing it like that from that and creating that standard set of test data as well. I mean, that's a huge step forward anyway, isn't it? If you go like, if you want to, it's because you can say like, here's a file. If you want to, we can put it out open source to say, if you want to test this particular, if you want to test that particular thing, here's a file that's got this particular attribute. That kind of at least makes it easier for a lot of other people to kind of get their first foot on the ladder.
And you have to bear in mind that there's nothing out there to verify this stuff as far as I'm aware. So even if we were to do this gradually and grow that test set, it's already an improvement from where we are today, right? So
absolutely.
I noticed actually one of the ISGs, sort of mimicking one of the documents, MSCFB, I think, or might have been the MS Doc, that they were using the augmented back as now form to define some of the structures and the data used in the file, and I wondered if that's very amenable itself to programmatically processing formats, etc. And I wondered if that might be another avenue of possibility if some of the ISGs are actually using the augmented brackets now form.
I think that was a point that was made yesterday. Is that the problem is that there's slight inconsistencies in the different ISGs. So some of them might be doing that, and in those cases we could probably leverage off of that. But in other cases we don't actually have that sort of that representation. No,
I just wondered because seeing it in there, I automatically thought, oh, that's amenable to being processed by programmatically, parsing the file and producing something from it.
Because I think it's quite interesting, because I think for some of these sort of things, it'd be interesting to see whether, if we export to XML or we export to Sizzle, that representation, if we're using and the apologies for some of those people that haven't seen it, we've got a tool that allows us to kind of visualize that tree, or to kind of that. So that might be just something. It's a matter of once we've kind of understand where things are in that tree with those particular sample files, we can say insert this into this particular place in the tree.
So here's a question that I was thinking about. At what level are we seeking to detect these things? I mean, assembly, like how, I guess what I'm wondering is, what language are we thinking to form something out of to actually process and find these things? Does that make sense?
I'm guessing you're asking what do we want to sort of represent these ISGs? What sort of format do we want to represent these ISGs in? Is that correct?
I was thinking more of being able to pull them out, being able to pull the things out from assembly and run it. I guess, you know, from that angle, I was just wondering which, like, what, and maybe what form. I don't know. I'll have to think more about how to phrase that, I guess. I'm thinking about how it would be.
When you say assembly.
Yeah. So like for instance, working with the different pixels and like actually having something that kind of, you're not looking at something that would actually go through the assembly language and find the different aspects of it.
Are you actually talking about the bit patterns, etc., that form the images on
exactly.
the pin? I don't think
precisely.
We don't go down to that lower level of the actual encoded data of the image itself.
Okay, because that's kind of what I was wondering, is if there was a way to actually, I mean, it would run.
I'm not sure if any exploits do go down to that level of actually. I'm no expert.
Other than sort of steganography and that sort of stuff.
Yes,
you do have some that go to that depth, I believe.
They do actually encode themselves inside the image data itself, do they?
Yeah.
Okay.
I recall one off the top of my head where I think for specific parsers, they're almost targeting specific parsers, and that you could actually exploit it by hiding something within that actual image data.
So we're not going to that level though.
Glasswall doesn't currently validate to that level.
Okay, but okay, all right. So I was just checking because that's kind of more what I've done in this area than.
I believe that the ISGs will probably go down to that level. So it's not a case that we ignore those. It's a case that would be a gap in Glasswall's validating and something that we could take action. And that's precisely what we're trying to get to.
That's kind of why I was asking.
Yeah, it's to try and identify those gaps using these ISGs.
I think I might cross-check my knowledge, but I thought in the PNG camera there are some. It does uncompress some image data in there and does some validation.
It's quite a high level validation.
Yeah. I think it was. I might take a look at that and see what. It's the same, from the same direction that Dennis was taking us, right, with his presentation through that area of Glasswall.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
So a lot of that stuff, I think, in terms of, because I think we're discussing quite a bit about our own technology, which is the import-export. And I think it's worth mentioning that stuff's actually, there's evaluation versions out there that anyone who's interested could actually try out and sort of play around with that as well.
If you just kind of want to, I can actually.
If you can run it through that'll be great, actually, Greg.
I can actually show. So this is going to be an export of an Excel, which doesn't actually come up. So it actually creates this file, which is kind of it's called a sizzle format, and there's a format that you can actually kind of. We've actually got a version that we can actually get this in a more human readable format, so it's a bit more obvious what the structure is. This is probably obviously not a very good example to actually use, because what you'd normally expect to see is from any file you'd get a number of these sizzle files, which is the various containers within a file, and then any images. But hopefully you can see that.
Can't see it yet. Oh, it's coming through.
Okay, sorry, my bad. What I'll do is I'll just. We're going to cheat a little bit. Let's see. Something that will show this.
Would someone mind dropping the link to the source code for the actual site, if you have that on a GitHub repo or whatever? Anyway, if you can drop me the link for the GitHub repo or whatever it is that.
Yep.
You can do that, Elvin. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pasting in a link to.
Yeah.
We're talking about the glass wall evaluation, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a look and see how far down it actually.
That should be in the chat. Can you see that?
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
I mean, it certainly varies depending on the file types. I mean, the Office ones, so the document formats, we break right down to very small structures and details, and I think sort of image and audio formats tends to be more sort of the container and the sort of the chunks level, and the actual sort of streams of data. Yeah. I think, as Vinh says, our rebuild product may do a little bit more than that when it needs to be brought across to the new. Yeah, you probably want the cleaned-up version of that sizzle. The XML is probably easier to see as well.
Yeah. I just say it is effectively it's a textual representation of the file, and this is not a particularly good example, but it kind of if you get the evaluation version and you can't try to expect some of the stuff, you can kind of see how you can get different things and how you can kind of look and inspect the content of a particular file.
Yeah, so what you're seeing is basically a description of every sort of structure within that document and the data that corresponds to that particular structure or field in the document. So it's a nested thing. So it's a DOM-like tree. So we can export this in XML as well, which was a lot easier to visualize. But yeah, that's effectively the internals of a file.
Yeah, I was looking at actually putting some of those into CSVs recently. So
I'll just try and run up the viewer, and I'll take a snapshot of that so people can see what that looks like.
Yep.
Out of interest, I'm looking at page 23 of the ping spec, and I perhaps Vinh can remember, but we do validation on the sort of, if you can see from that, the image width and height is a non-zero positive number. There you go. That's looking, yes, that's it. 1 to 10. I think we do kind of do that sort of thing. That's not actually going into necessarily the actual compressed data or the image data itself, but that's pretty getting close to making sure that the sanitization, a sanity check really.
That's correct, Martin, yeah.
Which is what I think we do go to that level.
Yes, we do.
At least, which is certainly, well, basically we can tick the boxes on that, I think. That's about as low as we go, I think. But my point partly being that the ISG isn't going any lower level than that, as far as I can tell. Which means that the exploit you were talking about, I think, would probably get through on the ISG checks.
I think there's probably 1 or 2 checks that goes down to that level. If I'm not mistaken, I might have seen 1 or 2. I can't recall which formats. I read these documents quite a while ago, so.
Yeah. Okay.
A lot of this kind of stuff I'm used to looking at more manually, so trying to figure out how to automate it will be actually kind of probably a fun part.
Steve, you've played around before with extracting information from PDFs, and sort of we've used that to kind of create templates for sort of structures when we were building stuff. Is that not a possibility here as well?
PDF?
Yes, from the PDF. For instance, I recall, if we go back quite a few years, we extracted a lot of the sort of information from Office specifications and built little structure templates in our intermediate form, which we then use to generate our stuff, our cameras. So is that not a possibility here to kind of use the same approach you did then?
No, I think you're thinking of Office actually. When we think of Word, when we were breaking Word up into chunks.
Yes, but we were extracting that data from the specs, which were in PDF format.
Oh, right. I'm with you. Sorry, the specification. Yeah. Well, actually, yeah. I wish. Actually, no, I cheated. Microsoft very, very kindly posted their specifications in PDF and on and as HTML. And what I realized was that they'd clearly built the whole thing in a database because the HTML was extremely regimented, and I was able to extract the lumps of structures and the sections, and then actually construct a database of each particular structure, its reference information, its format from that. Yeah, trying to do it from PDF is always the problem with PDF because it renders in its weird and wonderful bits and pieces all over the way. You don't get that level of consistency that you do with HTML. So yeah, that's how I got that info. If I'd have gone direct to PDF, I'd been a problem.
I think with PDF, you have to be careful because the way it tells it where to lay out text on a page, etc.
Yeah,
the text isn't adjacent either. You can be on a different layer. Or
saying that though, I have a long time in the past in another firm done work where I've had the same problem where there were tables in a PDF doc, which you did the normal sort of dump it to text and they were just splattered all over the place. And I did come across a tool that was able to extract tables and work out where they're meant to be and give you proper XML, proper sort of Excel spreadsheets out of them. So there are some PDF tools out there that are clever enough to work out what the text is, where it's trying to put it, and what its physical context is. So if you can get it down in that form, then there's the potential you could strip and organize it better.
So I've used a Python module that does something similar, but it pulls out the tables from PDF documents. So,
yeah, I've actually used that as well, Elvin. I was thinking of that when you said
actually, just coming back to, sorry, I know I'm going off a different tangents, but when we first started looking at these ISGs, it did immediately spring up something that I'd dealt with in the past in the automotive sector, but we had the same sort of problem where we have these huge specifications that you have to be proving that every little nuance in there, every little requirement, in this case you must do this, blah blah blah, and actually correlate it to the code and the model, proving that you've identified all of these steps. And we used various tools, and I did contact a friend of mine who still works in that sector, the one I remember, and he said, well, actually that wasn't that useful, but we now used something later on. It's still a fairly manual beast, but it does allow you to bring the document up and highlight things and say this belongs with this requirement, this belongs, and it tries to track them when they change. Hopefully these wouldn't change very often, but that was something that assisted quite strongly in building that up.
I'm actually thinking from a perspective of pulling out some of these sort of risks and recommendations into a form like JSON or XML. So as almost a first pass at the document. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to pull everything out. But if you can grab a lot of that information, then that speeds up the process of actually trying to sort of create intermediate representations of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, if there's enough consistency, or you can at least spot sections if they're fairly consistent with their titling. I mean, the thing that I did with those documents for Office was based on picking up, oh, this particular format was always applied to a heading, this format was always applied to a structure, and so on, and grabbing those bits out. So at least you grab them into sections, and some of them were quite neat and usable and could even have been encoded from, and others were a little bit more sort of loose in the way they were structured, and you at least you had what you're looking for there, which is at least some sort of captured list. You can go to that section, you will find all the info related to that. You might be able to automate from it, or you might not.
Yes. So the thing that I've noticed from these ISGs, at least on for individual file formats for a particular document, it does keep the formats consistent. They change from one group to the other, but for a particular one, it's usually consistent. For instance, across this whole PNG one, you will see risk and recommendation, and then the points in that same sort of form layout throughout the document. So it may be something where maybe we can have tools that work on specific sort of ISGs, and we can programmatically at least extract some of that information using those tools and then build the rest up later on.
Yeah. Well, I think we will probably find there is a ton of good PDF tools out there that will be automatable. So yes, if you can find something that works well, then yes, you've got that option. You can, once you've applied one, you can get the rest of them at least from each document, and maybe a few if there's some that have come from the same group and have used the same formatting.
Mm-hmm.
So are we going to use the newest one, or the one that is actually on the GitHub repo at the moment?
Are the versions in the GitHub repo not the latest versions?
No.
I believe it's 1 versus 1.1.
I think we just update the repository and we use the repo, right?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
There's no point in us trying to do it again. If there's a later version of the document, there's no point in us using an old version of the document.
Yep.
I agree. I am wondering how many of those are going to find their update now.
I think somebody
before
went through
before we actually start, processing them and developing processing them. I do wonder how.
Sorry, I was
how many of those are going to change.
I think somebody just went through the NSA site and just kind of to update the repo with all the latest stuff, and that's been done quite recently. So I mean, we can cross-reference and make sure, but my hope would be that we've got the latest versions there already. I think some of them, I suspect, and I think it's something that Dennis sort of mentioned, that maybe that because these documents are not necessarily getting a lot used by the community, that they don't get regularly updated or regularly looked at for some of them. And I think some of the specifications that they actually refer to actually haven't. I mean, Martin, you're much more au fait with a lot of these things than I am, but I think some of the specifications for some of the Firefox really haven't changed for a long time.
As far as I know, but to be honest, I haven't really looked. I do have. I think it was a couple of years ago or so. I probably did the updates, but I'm looking at the main NSA page here, and a lot of the dates are June 2019 and March 2019, and a lot of them are 2018. So, actually, I've just realised that the NSA page is in descending chronological order of date of the actual ISG.
Yeah,
I didn't spot that before.
I think the interesting thing for some of these is what potential new exploits may have been thought of by people after these documents were written.
Yes.
Yeah.
But isn't that partly? Aren't there other sites that are better placed to actually tell us that? CVE site or whatever that tells us the certain exploits for certain file types, for file formats.
Yeah, I mean, that might be one of those other things that we need to start looking at, is so we could actually find out where there are gaps in these recommendations and risks. We say, actually, it doesn't cover this new exploit that's actually been picked out, so maybe there's some changes that need to be done. That's a bit of an aside, but yeah.
I mean, in a sense, I think all of it is going to have to compare with something. We're going to have something to kind of run it against.
Yeah.
I mean, at least starting there, and then pulling in for each section that we complete. Maybe someone can pull in the parts that like that for each of the sections that we kind of set something up for it. Along with it, put that. But I mean, we have to kind of start somewhere, right?
I mean, there is some recommendations. You've got, it's always got, it seems to have most of the time this data hiding, data attack, recommendations.
Oh, that's interesting. I actually downloaded all the specs from Microsoft a few days ago when I was setting up my ThinkPad, and I've got all the standard Office documents and that here, and I've just looked and seen that the XLSX document is dated 18th of March 2020, barely 2 months ago. A new one was released. I wonder how many more. What about the DocX? What day is that? 19th of Feb 2020. I don't know if we're using any of the 2020 ones. That's
No,
interesting.
we're actually, that's actually something Harry's working on. He's on today. So yeah, we're actually working on updating those, Martin.
That's cool because the doc one, MS Doc, is 19th of November 2019. I like the way they version number those things with the ISO 8601 date format. You know exactly when it was released. But that's barely what 7 months old. So you say Harry's working on that?
Yep. Harry and myself. We're both.
So how are you? Because I found when I was doing this, they did pretty well document the revisions. And you could actually tell at a glance whether they were trivial revisions or they were actually important.
The benefit of this is that they provide us with XSDs, so we're able to use those XSDs to programmatically generate those updates. So
exactly
we're doing that programmatically.
Yeah, exactly what you need then.
So is that also potentially a way for some of these things where we do have those XSDs? Kind of a way to is that something that we could link those two to those XSDs?
Not sure. I'd have to think about it.
Yeah.
Not sure, but one of the things that's actually jumped out to me during this discussion is probably to speak to some of you guys, and that's looking at that import export to see if we can generate the data. And I also want to toy around with seeing if we can extract some of this information from PDF and sort of turn it into something meaningful. So I'll probably be discussing that with quite a few of you guys as well. And I'd suggest everyone sort of jump into that channel, the ISG channel, on the Open Summit, and we can kind of put all our thoughts in there.
And I've got another sort of question, I suppose, for some of the other test guys that I know are on the call. Kind of, if we're trying to kind of come up or somehow extract information to help with trying to generate some tests. But for the test guys, what would be the key things that you'd like to see there? What would be useful to you to kind of make your life easy?
Well, obviously the pass-fail criteria for it would be the number one thing, like what we're looking for and what we expect to happen under all the different circumstances. I mean, if we're expecting something to be in a certain range, we need to know what that range is and what we expect to happen within those ranges, things like that. If we expect entire areas to be missing, then we need to know that too, and what areas they're within, because we need to know what areas they're within in case the area they're within is missing as well.
I mean, I noticed that some of these sort of statements are actually quite broad. And I think we'd probably somehow, if we want to represent this, kind of generate some tests out of this, we'd kind of need to think about how you could represent different things that you'd need to check.
I mean, to be honest, as far as I'm concerned, the easiest way of doing that would be if we could actually convert the ISGs into our in-house DVL.
Yeah.
Then we could validate directly. That would be the easiest way of doing it. I suspect it wouldn't be quite as easy as it has been doing it for the actual specifications, but
I think if you get it into an intermediate format, then all of that becomes possible.
yeah, if we get it into something like JSON, then there's all sorts we could do to it. But getting it as DVL would allow us to do all the checks. Well, we could basically do a second, smaller version of Glasswall to ensure that we're conforming to these specifications as well.
Yeah, you might be duplicating stuff that's already there, just not. I mean, there is some benefit maybe at some point of trying to identify what validations we do that actually match these.
Just for a second, I would apologise to all the non-Glasswall employees on here, but if we were to produce a second very similar version of Glasswall, but remove our own validations and replace them purely with the validations from the ISGs, then we could take a file which we know fails the ISGs, run it through Glasswall, then run that regenerated file through something that only does ISG validation, and that would give us what we have and haven't scrubbed.
Possible.
That's a very interesting concept, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, we're trying a way sort of switching off one set of validations and using a different set.
Yeah.
To me, that would be the simplest way of doing it. Again, I apologise to all the non-glasswall people on here.
but think about it, Matt. That's not necessarily the worst thing. So if we're doing it in editor, where we can swap in and out cameras, that's actually quite doable, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, currently the validation is tied into them, but there's no reason that that couldn't be partitioned out in some way so that you could switch to a different set of validation rules for a particular. Yeah, it's.
I'm not saying it's the perfect solution.
No, it's an interesting idea. It's an interesting idea. Yeah, I think we can mull over that one. And they are kind of built really with this sort of work in mind. So yeah, we'll have to dust that off and make it work properly.
Very interesting, but I still feel that we should probably come up with an approach to first get this into an intermediate format and how we can also sort of generate the data.
Oh yeah, no matter what, we'll need both of those things, because if we try and build this data manually, then that's going to take months and months and months of entire teams.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of mulling over the. Well, I mean, yes, if you can get the rules out of this, it just, like you say, into like a first approximation. Sort of even if you can get something that can say, right, here's the sections, and then another pass that can go, right, these are easy to understand, can be mapped to something and be turned into a test, and then the ones that drop out at the bottom are the ones that need some manual intervention, which is not greatly different to our own sort of file and validation things, where a lot of the stuff automates and works, and sometimes there are edge cases that have to be massaged a bit. So you're still reducing the amount of manual work dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Quite interesting, because you just think about it. It's what you actually need. And that's the thing for me for a lot of this stuff is kind of when we try to represent it and try to do it is you start thinking about how much data, even for something that some of these, what data do you actually need to validate it? Okay, even for each of them, if you consider the validates, each validate you need at least one file. I mean, maybe for all the validations, you can have one file that says, yes, this meets all of them, so it will go through. I always like to have a different set of data for each test, but you might be able to get away with that. But when you start talking about the stuff we want to reject, then potentially you need, I think that can grow quite exponentially quite quick. If you're not careful.
Something just occurred to me, and this might be to yourself, Martin and Steve. In the past, when we were testing, when we were creating cameras, so the mechanism to validate a particular file format, we actually created test data for specific parts of a file structure, and we could use that just to verify that exact point. Is that not a possibility here as well? So, for instance, stuff like word dissection.
Yeah, and it certainly worked for a lot of the Office ones, because they did chunk up into sort of subsections and records, and we sort of paralleled the development work by getting groups of people to work on those subsections. So yeah, I guess we could still make use of that. So I certainly noticed that with Office. Obviously, that had the same sort of thing where there were the document discussed all sorts of things to do with Word, for example, but a lot of it was to do with the way it's stored in CFB, some of it to do with substreams that go in there. So they were all related but separate bits and pieces. So there are certainly elements of that where some bits would be common again, some bits could be broken out and dealt as tests for that particular subsection that is then reducing the amount of work on one place and allowing you to test those subsections.
The reason I say that,
I know what you mean. You just like sort of, you've got a particular thing saying, oh, this thing fails on that particular thing. Well, actually, that's a piece in itself, and we could test that lump rather than
the reason I say
file.
that is done to Greg's comment just now, that he likes to have individual sort of he'd like to have an individual file for each one of those points. But if you can create a file that covers all of that, and you've got a tool that's able to split those chunks out, and then you can compare those individual blocks, then you could process that in one hit, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, that's another truth, another way of doing it. Or you take the sort of unit testing approach. You know, you take a base file and you just keep making a mod to that version of it, run the test, and then go back, reset to the clean one, and just keep adding each particular test change to that base rather than having to maintain copies of them.
I mean, isn't it is an interesting sort of think about, just as I think about it now about creating some of the data. I mean, just thinking for ourselves, how our engine works is basically it validates everything and it gives you a full report of everything before it comes out. So maybe in some of these instances, you can have more, you know, lots of different issues in one file. I think though, if we're trying to create something that could be used more generally by the industry, then I think you kind of say, okay, here's you want something that isolates that particular issue, so that you know that you're not getting any false positives from anything else.
Yeah. So picture this scenario, Greg. So this is what I mean. So let's assume that we've got a file, just a single file that covers everything in here, all right? And we've got a separate tool that if you run it through that tool, it will actually break it apart into each one of the blocks in here. So point one will be a little snippet of binary, etc. So you could actually process the original file, the complete thing. And on the other side, you'll get a new file, right? A regenerated copy.
Yeah.
And you could run it through that tool again, which will then split it back into those blocks. And you can then compare two sets of blocks, the originals where you had those issues, and then the regenerated where you've now cleaned them up. And you'd expect that they'll differ at that point, that you should be able to then see that you've cleaned that stuff out. So that's more along the lines that I was thinking.
Okay.
So you have a whole suite of components. Each one is a little subsection that in itself is not necessarily a usable piece of document, but it is simply the snippet that contains the before and after, and you're just doing a bulk compare against all those before and after snips.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. As long, yeah, I guess that works for all things that you can put multiple bits of pieces. Clearly, there'll be occasions when there'll be tests in here that will be a different test to the exact same thing that only appears once in a file.
That's only for a particular theme of tests that you can have in these documents. Yeah, that's correct.
Are you saying group a lot of tests into one file? Is that what you mean?
Yes, if you can. So if you've got 4 different ways that you can corrupt several different parts of a document, you create a document that contains all those parts with all those corruptions in, and then strip them out into their components, just as a way of being able to do a sort of a spread test to show that all those subsections have been correctly repaired.
That would apply, for example, to cases where you have to cleanse the file, where you're expected to remediate or repair the file or correct a specific part of that file. So it wouldn't apply to places where you're actually going to have to reject the file because,
Just thinking aloud, Steve. So with something like the data viewer, that gets done, doesn't it, after it's kind of looked at the file or after it's run through the remediation?
Data viewer currently shows you the tree structure after it's been read and validated, but not before the.
So wouldn't it would be, if you imagine if the data viewer could actually show you where it doesn't make its validations fail.
Sorry, where it doesn't what?
Where if because on that tree when you show it that does it actually show you where stuff's failed on the validation?
It doesn't as yet, but that was something that's been discussed as an idea of being able to sort of have a before and after stages, because the output buffer would be able to be presented, and we could diff those things and map those diffs back into the tree. So there's various ways we could show snapshots of the different stages, and we could do this. We could do similar things with potentially with our export. I mean, currently that goes through validation, so you could potentially get a mode where you disable the validation on one export pass and then do another pass with the validation, and then you'd have to Sizzle or XML files that you can do diffs on another tool. So there's all these things sort of expand a lot of capabilities now.
I think overall also we got potentially lots of, it's thinking about how we can kind of get that representation from the actual ISGs itself, and how to actually drive some of the text generation, the data generation. I think it's quite a few ideas.
Yeah, it's finding a sort of a consistent, easy to roll out, easy to scale up without masses of manual effort, I think. So what can be automated, what can't be. I mean, sort of look. I mean, the examples there are sort of very, very clear, but getting that into machine readable form, it's you're reliant on the style of the language being concise. See, that was something I noted in Microsoft specifications. That was something I tried to do something with, but it did require better software to do it. But I noticed that a lot of the definitions for bits seem to have very concise, very legal style sentences constructed in them. So you could say, well, actually, if you could find that one that says this will form of such and such with this in, and this will be not that, you could see that actually you could have potentially extracted a lot of rules from that. As it was, we obviously got a lot of people to manually go through that, but it did look concise enough that it could have been, it clearly came from some sort of automated resource in the first place. If these documents are that concise, so for example, the way they phrase that, if there's no data before the IHDR track, if that sort of style of sentence sort of turns up repetitively, suggesting they've used templates to create these documents, then you've got something you could potentially latch onto. If it's a bit more free form, then that then unfortunately becomes a problem. But that may be where we can, in some cases, extract a lot that does conform in particular neat ways. You need some sort of reasonably good sort of natural language parsing of some sort. So it might be a job for some machine learning tools.
I suspect in the end what we're going to end up doing is probably doing some of the early ones manually, just to kind of learn how to actually represent him, and as we go through more and more of them, kind of realizing there's these common patterns. I'm
actually thinking of putting together a couple of actions after the session, which are for us as a team to kind of look into. And I'll reach out to various of you guys and see if you can help me with this. And that would be to kind of experiment with some of the tools to extract some of this information programmatically, and kind of have a first cut of, say, JSON or XML representation of this. And I'm also going to look into sort of using our own exported structure to see if we can start manipulating that stuff, and what would be involved in getting that to work to generate the test data.
If we do for one of them, then we can put it all in the repos, trying to get feedback of, is this a good representation? Does it make sense?
Yep.
I think it's one of those things. I think there's a lot of stuff that might be, great, if it's easy for us to consume, that's fine, because it helps us on our day jobs and kind of stuff like that. But I'd also like it to be kind of get that, if it's public, other people can come along, pick it up and say, yeah, actually that makes sense. That's something I can use.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
Okay. I think we're kind of naturally running out of steam on this, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
Has anybody's got any other thoughts, comments, or suggestions?
I think you probably have sort of got to the bulk of what we can sort of think about in terms of how we can approach these, what the essential requirements are. It does sound like a bit of research trying to find some maybe there's some some tools out there, but yeah, so there's a lot of details of how we achieve it. I think it's going to be a case of looking for what's out there that might achieve some of these sorts of, or might deal with these sorts of problems. I can't believe, as I say, I was certainly aware of tools in the past that have assisted in this sort of work. There may well be some from that sort of domain that automate some of that work as well. So
cool. I'll probably speak to you after this, Stephen. I want to explore some of that and actually see if we can, even if it's just a very small example of it, see if for the next session we can have something to show for it. So that would be pretty neat, I think.
Yeah, okay. Right. Everyone didn't notice I did post a little pink picture of the data viewer and use looking at a PNG file. Just to sort of see the level of detail that we deconstruct to. All right. Does that sound like it's a good point to wind up? I think, is it?
Yeah. I think you can probably stop the recording there.